Hello, welcome to Transformation Tuesday. Happy Tuesday, guys. Welcome aboard. Give us a shout out as you're jumping on. I hope you're doing well. Tonight is a powerful episode on how do we upgrade, I call them standards, but whether you want to call them, I just call them standards. How do we upgrade our standards, our benchmarks across our whole entire life? Hey Dora, how you doing? So I'm looking at the specifics about how do we upgrade our standards, how do we upgrade our benchmarks for how we choose to live, how do we live by standards of excellence, how do we stem from a place of heart space and spirit when we're enforcing this or living by this so that we don't beat ourselves up, and also how do we get more and more specific around how do we actually live this in terms of practical, tangible tools and turn this into a way of living. Hey Dora, hope you're doing well. Hello guys, and welcome. Let's dive straight in. How do we hack our standards? And I'd love to know from you guys if this is something you've looked at before. Let me know if you've actually looked at standards. Have you looked at what are your benchmarks for how you choose to live your life? What are the if you like, what are the sub goals? What are the daily goals? What are the daily benchmarks that you're aiming for? Now, I'm going to give you some examples as we go through here so we know what we're talking about when we're talking about benchmarks. First of all, we're talking about what are those targets that we're looking to hit. Now, I'll give you some examples of benchmarks that I've got. I've got benchmarks for the amount of water that I want to drink each day. I've got benchmarks for my hourly meditation process that I do. I've got benchmarks for my morning ritual. I've got benchmarks for health and nutrition. I've got benchmarks for the amount of supplements that I have each day and each week. So these are some examples of benchmarks. I've got benchmarks around how much sleep I get, right? So I've set a bedtime when I go to bed so that I know I get enough sleep. So another example, the number of times I exercise during the week, another benchmark. So typically I want to exercise every single day. That's a benchmark I've got, is setting myself a benchmark of exercise or movement every single day. So this is a powerful topic, this is a powerful subject where we can get clear on our benchmarks, on our standards for how we choose to show up in life. This becomes a really powerful way of essentially upgrading all the different areas of our life because we now have specifics. We now have something to hold ourselves accountable to. We now have a recipe. We've got a philosophy for how we want to do our life. So this is a powerful topic, and when you can start to implement benchmarks and standards across all the different dimensions of your life and start to document them and be conscious of them, you start to create almost like I don't want to call it a rule book because rule is too regimented, but it kind of is like a recipe for creating success, because when you set what those standards are for your life, you have something to live by. You can live by principles. You can live by benchmarks and standards as opposed to living by fluctuating emotions. You can live by principles and guiding philosophies rather than, oh, do I feel like doing this today? So I would suggest a much more empowered way to live is to live by principles. Hey Dora, good to see you. Live by principles more than to live by the fleeting motivation that we have in the moment. And I'll touch more on that as we go. I just got your question here. How is a benchmark different to a goal? They're very similar. So just a very subtle difference. A benchmark meaning a standard that you want to introduce consistently. So it's about consistency, whereas a goal can be more of a one-off. So a goal is something out there in the future. It is like a project or some kind of outcome. Whereas a benchmark is a little bit more specific. Benchmark is more around, well, what's the level of excellence that we're aiming for? So imagine that, a benchmark is maybe a meter of 100 down to 0. Now, how you show up in an average day, your benchmark for how you're showing up, if you're showing up with an incredible amount of intensity, with living your values, being congruent, being aligned, then you might rate yourself as 100 out of 100. So that would be a benchmark of how you set the attitude or the philosophy for how you want to live. So that would be it's almost like a scalable, quantifiable, measurable process that we're now using to turn what's essentially an invisible process of upgrading our life into a very visible, very tangible process. So it's setting measurable levels, if you like, to assess how we're doing in a lot of the consistent areas of our life. So that's the difference between a benchmark and a goal. So, hey Paul, hey Monica, good to see you guys here. So we're talking about standards and benchmarks. So we've given you some examples of the types of standards, or some examples of standards and some examples of benchmarks. Now you can come up with your own. I encourage you guys, if you guys have benchmarks of your own, please I'd love to hear what you've got. Hey, Monica, please, if you have standards around the amount of sleep you get, the amount of hydration, the quality of the food that you eat, the amount of time that you spend with your friends or your family. These are all categories of benchmarks. And the more specific that we can get without having attachment to it, and I'll talk more about this in a moment, without having attachment to, i.e. meaning if we don't hit those benchmarks, we don't necessarily need to judge ourselves. This is not the point. The point of this very early phase of defining what are our standards and what are our benchmarks is for the purpose of getting clear on, well, what is a version of excellent or a version of high quality? What's the degree of excellence that I want to subscribe to in my life? Now, I recommend that we don't necessarily have to go all in and seek perfection in every dimension of our life. In fact, I don't recommend you do that because it's the fastest way to kill your motivation. What I do recommend you start to introduce is little elements of standards of excellence so that you can build yourself up. Well, what do I mean? Well, for example, for me, what I have now is a standard of excellence around meditation. So for me, I have a daily practice of meditation. I have multiple types and styles of meditation to do throughout my day. However, in the morning, as a very minimum, I do what I call a soul connection meditation, which is a powerful connection process where I connect with my true self. And what I also then do is I also have a 20-minute meditation. So my benchmark around meditation as a minimum is I hit those 2 meditations. And then what I also do is I also have an hourly meditation process that goes, my phone alarm goes off throughout the day. And for some of my clients that are watching this, you'll know that this is a process that you've been using and it transforms your way of being and transforms your life. So when you hit those benchmarks, you turn success into a process. How about that? When we set and when we hit benchmarks, we turn success, life success, into a process. We turn success into a recipe. So when we can quantify, well, what are the different benchmarks of excellence that we want to strive for, we can infuse these standards throughout our life and we've now got something to aim for. We now have a target. We now have a recipe for, well, if I hit all these benchmarks during the week, I'm going to have a pretty good week. If I hit my benchmarks for sleep, for hydration, for food, for exercise, for time with family. When we define all of these benchmarks, we have a recipe for success. So we turn success into a process. Hey Matt, good to see you here, buddy. So what we're now getting into is we're now starting to get a bit more specific. So I encourage you to look at each of the different dimensions of your life. And I'd love to hear if you guys have specific benchmarks that you've already set around maybe time with a partner, maybe time exercising, these sorts of things. So I'd love to know what your benchmarks are. Now, you might not have officially written them down as these are my benchmarks, but maybe unconsciously you've already carved out these elements as a habit. Maybe you've already created benchmarks in your life, but you're not even aware of it. So what I'm suggesting here is we take this a whole lot deeper and we start to become even more conscious about what are the benchmarks. So you could look at each dimension of your life. So as per usual, whatever topic we're talking into, we can split this topic into all the different dimensions. So you can have benchmarks around relationship, around finances, around health. I'll give you some examples. Benchmarks around finances could be each week you're wanting to save a particular amount of money or put a particular amount of money aside for a particular cause. Donate it to a charity, put it into a savings account, pay off a particular home loan. So that would be a benchmark around finances. Benchmark around health would be the amount of exercise you're getting. How many times yoga do you do? How many times do you do yoga per week? How many times do you meditate per day or per week? How many minutes or how many hours of meditation? So this is a process where we make the invisible visible. We're now mastering our life into a process. And the only way that we can do that is to hold ourselves accountable, have conscious awareness of, well, what are our standards? And if we don't have any standards, well, that's great as well, because it means we can now define the standards. We can create what they are. Now, when you become aware of your standards, you now have something to work with because you can evaluate, well, how are you doing? How do your standards compare to other people? Not from a place of judgment, but I think it's great to evaluate, well, this is what I'm doing. What's everyone else doing? Can I raise my standards? Can I elevate my level of my sense of professionalism as a human being? Can I elevate it? How am I doing? So again, this is not for the purposes of comparison to judge ourselves. It's for the purposes of gathering data and information about, cool, let's hack all the information, all the other examples of people around us to build out some pretty powerful benchmarks. So you can build out benchmarks in every single dimension of your life. I recommend you also have benchmarks for things like learning, for growth. You might say you might want to tune into Chris's Transformation Tuesday once a week as an element to supplement your personal development and your growth. You might have a particular amount of reading or learning, podcasts, books that you want to read per day, per week. So I encourage you to split every single dimension of your life into a particular category and then start to define and document what are the benchmarks for living a life of excellence, for living a life that's authentic. Now, I also want to touch here on the point of excellence. Sometimes what we can do is we're buying into someone else's version of success or someone else's definition of excellence. Now for you, if for whatever reason you have limitations around your time, your money, your resources, for whatever reason if you have limitations and you can't live up to the highest level of excellence, i.e. perfection, then that's okay. You evaluate your life and you say, under the circumstances and under the challenges and requirements that you currently got in your life, what is going to be sustainable? I think sustainability is a key factor here because you could set benchmarks of excellence across every dimension of your life, but if it's not sustainable, then it becomes very, very difficult to actually keep up that motivation. And as I said, if you wanted to start meditating, I do 20 minutes, I do a block of 20 minutes in the morning every morning. Now, you don't have to hit 20 minutes. If you've only just started meditating, you don't have to strive for 20 minutes. You could aim for 2 minutes, right? Start for the first week of doing 2 minutes. Then the next week, bump it up to 3 minutes, then 4 minutes. So you progressively build up all of these standards across all the different areas of your life. I recommend building up these standards over time. Don't necessarily go in and just max them out and aim for the highest standard you possibly can right now, because what it's going to lead to typically is it's going to lead to overwhelm. It's going to lead to you trying to do too much. So I recommend introducing these standards at a pace that's going to be sustainable. That's the key word, is sustainability. So let me know if that resonates, because I can tell you right now, there's a lot of people out there, particularly at the start of the new year, they'll set goals and also benchmarks for themselves that may be unrealistic, right? Now, for example, if you don't even have a gym membership, if you haven't exercised in months, and then all of a sudden it gets to the 1st of January and you're now saying, right, I'm going to be doing exercise every day and I'm doing yoga 4 times a week and I'm going to do this, I'm going to revolutionize my health and my life. That's a massive jump. You're overriding so many different habits and so many different neurological connections. It's a strain, it's a stretch. So I recommend you introduce one new standard each week in and around each dimension. So for example, you might pick one. You might pick health and you say, right, yeah, well, what's the standard around flexibility or exercise or nutrition? You pick one of those little sub-dimensions, and once you pick a dimension like health, you can then pick sub-dimensions. So the sub-dimensions of health will be things like sleep, nutrition, exercise, flexibility, strength, gut health. You can infinitely expand that category of health into all these infinite subcategories. So when we think about categories, when we think about standards around health, well, the good news and maybe the bad news, depending on how you look at it, is that then it becomes infinitely subdivisible into all the other subcategories, which is even more work, even more growth, even more stretch. So I encourage you guys that are the ones that are looking to take your life to the next level and looking to push things, I recommend starting to look into the subcategories, right? Sleep, hydration, nutrition, gut health, all these types of areas, supplementation. Now start to set yourself sub-standards in each of those sub-areas. So what you're starting to build is you're building a matrix. You're building a matrix of all the different major categories, but then all the different minor subcategories under each one of these. And you can set standards and benchmarks for those as well. So this becomes a really powerful process. Now, if you haven't done this process before, I definitely recommend have some compassion for yourself. Start to create awareness of, well, what are your standards? What are they? Just inquire. Inquire around, do you even have standards around exercise or nutrition or hydration? Do you have standards around how much sleep you get? I encourage you to take a look at it and don't judge yourself. Just be aware of it. It is what it is. And then look forward and say, right, well, what's a sustainable standard that you can start with? And then also keep an eye out for, well, what's the ultimate standard that you're striving for? If you were the best version of you, if you're the most professional, most perfect version of you, what would that standard be? And just have awareness of that. Not necessarily just set a standard of perfection, because I don't recommend doing that because it's unattainable. But what I recommend doing is start to stretch yourself or start to create awareness of the stretch. And when you start to create awareness of, well, where am I now? Where do I want to be? You can gauge your level of awareness about how you're doing. You have a gauge point to assess, what are my standards like? Am I striving for 100 out of 100? Or are my standards kind of maybe 10 out of 100 right now? So it's kind of the same as if you go to the gym. Now, you might walk up to the bar and you're wanting to lift maybe 20 kilos. Now, that's fine. You can start lifting whatever weight you're ready to lift. However, you've actually got to consider, well, what's the weight that I'm considering striving for? Do I want to get to 100 kilos? Do I want to get to 50 kilos? What's my ultimate maximum benchmark that I'm really wanting to get to? So that gives you some idea about, well, now how do you plan for that? Maybe you then build up at a kilo each week. If you want to lose weight, maybe you want to lose, do a certain amount of exercise each week and then slowly build it up. So you've got to start considering what's the ultimate vision for ourselves. I think that's the key question here. Now, when I say the ultimate vision, what I'm talking about here is what's the most authentic version of us where we're showing up as the best version of ourselves, which is not always necessarily spending all of your time in a particular area. You've got to evaluate your life and say, well, if you're being authentic to your true self, whereabouts are you striving for excellence, right? Whereabouts, maybe if you're a parent, maybe you're setting parenthood as a category of striving for excellence. Now, as a result of focusing on parenthood, maybe that means there's less time and energy and resources to focus on the other areas. So naturally, the benchmarks you're going to set in other dimensions, if you're focusing on parenting, it's not going to be as high, which is okay. If you're okay with it, and if your authentic true self resonates with the benchmark that you've set based on all the requirements and all the standards and all the commitments that you've got, that's all that matters. So again, it's important to have compassion. Have compassion that you're not going to get perfection in every single area. It's not about perfection. It's about simply striving for growth and improvement day by day. I would suggest that's the best way to approach this. Strive for growth, strive for improvement. Don't compare yourself to the perfect version of you in terms of judging yourself. Look at the most perfect version of you and go, well, how realistic, how sustainable is that? I would suggest that's a better approach so that you don't do overwhelm and you don't necessarily judge yourself. So key part of this is having compassion for self. We're never going to be perfect. However, we need to start to explore and experiment and test what is a sustainable standard of excellence. And I would suggest start pushing the limit. Start slowly and then start pushing it more and more and more. So I'd love to know if you guys have had experiences where you've set a standard pretty high and maybe for whatever reason you haven't been able to sustain that. So let me know if you can relate to not wanting to set standards that are too high because they're unsustainable. At the same time, you don't want to set standards that are too low because what you can do is you can kind of undershoot and you can actually, it's kind of a bit of a cop-out. So you've really got to have awareness of, well, what is that standard that you want to set so that you can feel like you're honoring yourself. So you can feel like, well, you're not copping out, but you're also not setting standards that are ridiculously high. You know you're not going to meet them, which is perfectionism. You've got a nice middle road, which is a good starting point, and then from there you can build on it. So I also recommend you have standards around things like career or business. How many hours a week do you want to work in your business or in your career? Right? What's now again, I know this concept of work-life balance isn't necessarily relevant for everyone at every stage in business. However, I think it's great to start to look at, well, what are the standards in business, right? When do you want to show up to work? Do you want to get to work late or do you want to get to work early, right? What sort of workplace do you want? Do you want a tidy workplace? Do you want a messy workplace? How frequently do you want to clean your house? How many hours a week do you want to work? And these sorts of things. Are you going to work on weekends? When you get home, do you want to check your emails? So these are all substandards that you need to evaluate and come to a point of acceptance within yourself around what are your standards. And there's no right, there's no wrong, there's no judgment, there's no good, there's no bad. There's just, well, what are your standards? What do you want your standards to be for your life? And that's a very, very powerful introspective topic that is going to create a lot of awareness and then empowerment for you to decide what standards you want to live your life to. Same thing with maybe holidays. How many holidays do you want to treat yourself to per year? Right? Maybe looking at self-care. What are the standards around self-care? Like maybe a chiropractic or massage. What sorts of things do you want to treat yourself to? Maybe taking care of yourself. Maybe going and having a checkup with a GP once a year if you need it. So again, looking at health, finances, career, business, relationships, education, all these dimensions are important. You've got to document and you've got to create a matrix, create a spreadsheet, create some kind of document that starts to quantify this whole process, and you'll find that it gets a lot easier. So that's going to be my suggestion as a starting point, is look at the categories and then look at the subcategories. This is a powerful process. Now, when you can now document your standards and define what are those standards, you can now hold yourself accountable. You can now evaluate your performance. you can now get to the end of your week, and I definitely recommend everyone does this, is at the end of your week on a Sunday or whenever the end of your week is, definitely do a check-in. Evaluate your benchmarks, evaluate your standards. How did I go for sleep this week? How did I go for time with relationships? How did I go for nutrition? How did I go for hydration? How did I go for working? How did I go for being present to my partner maybe? Maybe that's a standard that you've got of when you're having a conversation with someone, being present to them. So this is the key thing, and this might just sound like it's kind of a weird thing, but presence with the people around you is one of the most important parts of being in a relationship. Because if you're not present to the person who's in front of you, then how can you possibly show up as the best version of you? How can you, in the context of that relationship, how is that person going to know that they're loved? How does that person feel wanted? So, and this doesn't matter whether it's an intimate relationship, but it's just friendships in general, or even just work colleagues or your team, is when you're present to them, you're connected and you're consciously aware of what's unfolding in that moment. So for a lot of people, they're in a conversation and they'll check out. Tell me if you guys can resonate. You might be speaking with someone and then all of a sudden you get distracted and you're talking with them and you're kind of nodding and agreeing with them, but your mind's gone elsewhere. Now, that's just being completely vacant and disrespecting the communication that's unfolding. Now, we've all done it. I've done it before. And if I ever do it, I catch myself out so quickly and I actually apologize to the person. Now, this is, again, another powerful benchmark around presence. You can set benchmarks around presence. When you're communicating someone, whether it be on the phone, you're not checking the internet while you're on the phone with them. When someone's speaking to you, you have your full undivided attention placed on that person and you're totally present to them. So that's another standard. These are more, if you like, these are more softer, indistinguishable standards. You can't really quantify it, so to speak. It's more of a quality behind it. However, it's still a standard, it's still a benchmark. So I encourage you to explore some of these non-quantifiable benchmarks like standard. Also things like love. You can create benchmarks around love. I recommend everyone here learns about love languages. For those of you that have found out about love languages and know what your love languages are, you'll probably already know what I mean, how powerful this is. But when you identify what your love language is, but also the love language of your partner, you can now create benchmarks around showing love. For example, if you know that your partner's love language is quality time, right? Quality time, you know, well, in order for them to experience love from you, you've got to give them quality time. Now, that's just the nature of a relationship. Everyone's going to have their own unique love language. So what you know from that is, great, let's set some benchmarks around spending quality time together. Great. If we set some benchmarks around, let's have regular date nights, let's create some regular meetings, let's create regular time together, that is how you're going to be able to hack your relationship. You're going to generate more love because you now have benchmarks around, great, what are we aiming for? How do we know if we've got a good quality relationship? How do we know that we're experiencing love? Benchmarks. Right? What are you actually doing? How are you being? So this is where it gets really, really powerful. Hey Joe, good to see you here, mate. Hope you're well. We're talking about benchmarks and standards. So the benchmarks and standards are going to create the recipe for your success. They are going to determine how you can set up systems and structure in your life to turn all these things into a habit. So benchmarks ultimately start out as an operating manual or some sort of checklist that we're striving for. And then after a while, when we do them so often and refer back to them, and every week we review them, we can actually carve out a habit. We can turn every single standard and benchmark into a habit, into an unconscious, ingrained behavior. So that's what I definitely recommend everyone strives for, is you want to have regular, consistent check-ins and check in how you're doing. How are you living your standards? And are your standards of excellence? Are they standards of mediocrity? And again, it's not from a place of judgment. It's just, let's have an honest evaluation. How are our standards? How are we actually doing? So this is a powerful conversation. Definitely one I recommend you take a really deep, long look at. What are your standards across all those different dimensions? And if you're in a relationship, also ask your partner. Maybe they can take a look at their standards as well. Now again, this is not from a place of judgment. This is not from a place of diminishing self. This is simply an evaluation of where are we at. It's simply a measuring stick. How are our standards? How are we doing in life? So I've given you a lot of examples of standards. I've given you a process to follow in terms of create a template, create a spreadsheet and start to document your standards. I've given you a process whereby every week you want to check in with your standards. How did I do? So you want to measure yourself against the standards. How did I go? So I definitely recommend having a check-in process. Spend at least half an hour, an hour every week checking in. How did you perform? How did you go? Now, it's not just evaluating yourself against your standards, but it's also just evaluating your life. And I've touched on this before, that you really want to check in on things like, right, what sort of emotions did I have this week? Was I experiencing fear, anxiety, or stress? Was I experiencing joy and fulfillment? What was I experiencing? What were the limitations I experienced this week? What were the limiting beliefs? What were the fears? What were the conflicts that I had? Where was I not connected? Where was my ego running the show? All these sorts of questions as well are really powerful. And so if you bundle this up into your weekly review, you can create a really powerful self-assessment process that happens every single week. I also have a sub-process that I do every single day in terms of journaling. So I'm going to give you guys a whole nother Facebook Live on the process of journaling, morning rituals, a lot of other things. I'm also going to do one on how to discover your purpose, and how to live your purpose. There's so much more. As you can imagine, there's a lot of different pillars. There's a lot of different concepts, and they all tie in together. They're all connected. So I'm just giving you snippets of this now, and then next week or next class, you'll figure out how do I blend that with that? How do I mix those things together? And it all comes together in this beautiful tapestry. All these components of life mastery, they all come together in the most amazing way. And every single week it builds upon the last concept. So it strengthens, it builds, it's like a big snowball. So when you start applying each of these concepts more and more consistently, you will find all the different dimensions of life start falling in place. So that was standards, that was benchmarks. Thanks, Dora. Glad to support, glad to share what I can. So that was benchmarks and standards, guys. Please trust me, this is a powerful process that will transform your way of being. It will transform the way that you think about everything. And I encourage you to create standards around everything. And again, the most important thing here is don't judge yourself. Have compassion for yourself. Don't strive for perfection. It's not attainable, it's not sustainable, it's unrealistic. Start by setting realistic, achievable standards and then build them. Start to push the limit. So I'll leave you with that, guys. Thank you for tuning in. Happy Transformation Tuesday, and I'll see you again next week. Thanks again. I look forward to seeing you guys soon. Bye for now.